Welcome to Productive Joy with Dr. Christie, where fun meets action.
Hi, friends. Welcome to Productive Joy. Today is another day of a fabulous guest that you're going to learn all kinds of things from. But before we get started, if you are not already following this podcast, I really need you to do so. Please share it with your friends. I promise you it will not be a waste of your time. You will get your shot of B12 and you will learn all kinds of things. Today is absolutely no exception. We have with us Michael McCormick, who is a lot of things. Let me tell you what he is. He is an avid shopper. He is a failed retiree. He's a twin dad. I'm a twin mom, so I can appreciate that. He's a former superintendent. He's also a native Californian, which you don't find all the time. And my personal favorite, he is a former AM radio disc jockey. So, Mike, welcome to Productive Joy.
Well, thanks so much. I'm excited to be here. I've been looking forward to this for a long, long time. So thank you for having me on the show.
Oh, Mike, we're going to have some fun today for sure. But the reality is people only listen for a short time. And so we need to hook them with something. So why don't you give us some kind of 30-second speech that will make people want to keep listening?
You know, my favorite quote is from Joseph Campbell. And it goes something like this: "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek."
Ooh.
And it's this idea that we all live with fear. I'm riddled with fear. I've been riddled with fear since I was a little boy. But if we can somehow find the energy and stick with it and get through that wall of fear, man, great things can be on the other side. And especially for those that are in leadership positions, you know, some of us, I think our deepest, darkest held, fear is, am I going to get fired today for what I'm doing? Right? So let's hook them in.
Oh my gosh, Mike, already mic drop. Like we could walk away and they would be better because they just heard that. I think we all carry fear differently, but we all carry it all day, every day. And if we can just let go of that and recognize that we are perfectly capable to handle just about anything that gets thrown at us, I think we'll be okay. So let's start, Mike. I know you were a superintendent for a long time in a California district, but why don't you tell us how you got there? Because you didn't start as a superintendent, but you did definitely end your educational career there. So how did that journey go?
Yeah, I love, thanks for asking that. I'll try to give you the summary of the summary of the summary.
Fair.
I was a teacher, loved teaching, taught for 6 years. Prior to that, my first professional job was actually working in juvenile corrections as a probation person. And so I was working in juvenile hall with incarcerated youth, doing the night shift, graveyards. And it was about 3:00 in the morning. My supervisor came by just to make sure I was still awake. And he was one of these kind of crusty old people. And he says, kid, you seem pretty bright. Why don't you go back to school, get your teaching credential, and see if you can have a positive impact in today's youth before they get tangled up in the juvenile justice system. And I took his advice. So here's the thing. I go back to school. I come back. My first teaching assignment is first grade.
Oh, boy.
I kept making the kids cry. I think the transition between juvenile probation and first grade was a little dramatic. So very quickly they said, you know what, you might be an upper elementary teacher. So they moved me up to 6th grade. I was sure I was going to get canned. So fast forward, I get sucked into middle school and secondary education. So I'm brand new assistant principal, talking with my principal, who's been a long time. I think he was a middle school principal for like 20 years.
Oh my.
And he says, Mike, what's your long-term plan? I said, I want to be a superintendent. And he just belly laughed. He thought that was the funniest thing he'd ever heard in his whole life. Why would I want to go to the district office, join the dark side of education? And so, years later, that was my goal early on. And so middle school principal, high school principal, assistant sup of ed services, finally superintendent. And the beautiful thing, and I want to talk about this a little bit later, is I was with my district, the one that I just retired from, for 27 years. Now, I didn't start my career there, But being in the same place for 27 years, there's some unexpected gifts that come with that.
Well, that's longevity, right? That's historical knowledge, that's institutional knowledge. And you brought all of that to the table in that top seat. What was it about superintendency? Because for those of you that are not in the education space, a superintendent is like a CEO of a district, right? They're the ones that the buck stops with you and you make all of the decisions that makes everything else run smoothly or not so smoothly, depending on if you're good at your job, right? But what was it about the superintendency that appealed to you?
I think it was just that craving to make a difference
Mm.
and lead a team and build relationships. And I think the thing that made it so wonderful from my perspective, others may not hold that
Yeah,
same thought,
the jury's out. It's okay.
but but between my time as an assistant superintendent and a superintendent, that was 15 years. I had a 15-year stretch. And so oftentimes in education, people are searching for that silver bullet and kind of jumping from one initiative to the other. And we were able to stick with some very simple goals for many, many years, to the point where I had teachers coming to me and saying, okay, Mike, it's a little boring now. What's the next thing? And we always pushed. I don't want to give the wrong impression, but to be in a place to see some of those ideas become really driven deep into the fabric of the system, super powerful, probably the joy of my life.
Well, and how cool, right? And I think that translates into any industry that if you give something enough time, if it's the right something, great things will happen. Now, we can also become complacent in that space and do things because we've always done them, but that's not what I heard at all. Instead, you said, all right, what are our very clear goals? And how do we make sure that all of our actions are pointing us towards those goals consistently? And I'm sure you saw success from that. How did you build the kind of team that could help actually reach those goals? Because that can't happen just because you decreed them in the kingdom, right? Like that's not how that works. How did you build the team that was necessary to make sure those goals were reached?
Yeah, I think it comes down to a formula like number one, you got to love kids. That's something that's hard to teach. I found people either love kids or they see the work as a job. And so that's number one. The second thing is on my cabinet team, I looked for people that had very different ideas than me. This concept, and it took me a while to grow into this, but this idea of this creative abrasion where you've got lots of different voices, different perspectives at the table, it really does lead to better decisions. So looking for people that have different perspectives, different ideas, I think that's super important. And people who, if they came up through the teaching ranks, they're really good teachers. And then finally, and I think most importantly, it was this idea of, do people, are they happy people? Are they joyful people? Are they people that love people? Because more than anything, education is a people business. And so I think this idea of being able to have fun at work, obviously you got to get the work done, but to create this culture where it really is a family that you're building. And what I mean by family, I mean, you're not just, I would tell my principals, don't just ask your teachers about their instruction or what the kids are studying. Ask them about their family. How are their own kids doing? And when you can develop relationships, not only the relationships that I was building over many years in the district, but when others on the executive team are doing the same thing, ultimately, I think that builds trust in the organization and it shows that we actually care about each other as human beings. And you can get people to be highly productive in that joyful space.
Yes, you can. I totally agree. So I don't know if you know that I've written two books, but the second book that I wrote is called Make Work Fun So People Don't Quit.
Yeah.
Because people quit things that aren't fun, right? And you just said that exact thing. Make sure they're having fun at work. They want to be there. You also mentioned that this is you were in the business of people. And I would argue that any organization should be in the business of people. Now, I might be creating a product, but ultimately I'm still in the people business, because if the people that are working for and with me aren't on the same page and don't feel like they have a voice in the process, they walk. There are other things they could do with their talents. And just in the short amount of time that I've known you, a couple months now, I have seen you do that very naturally with any humans that you end up near. Is you immediately build that relationship. You find out something about them. I'm really sad that your dog is not sitting behind you right now, because it might be the cutest dog I've seen in a long time. And I have several of my own. But it's things like that, right? Like, you notice people's dogs, you ask them about their children, you have the conversations about who are you at a core level, because the work will be the work and it'll happen. But who are you at the core level? And it's clear to me that's just who you are. Who taught you that? Where did you learn that?
I think I came from a pretty dysfunctional childhood.
Mm.
Mom and dad divorced when I was very young. I'm an only child. And so I think very young, like, people that might be listening may not be old enough to remember this term, but latchkey kid.
Oh, I
Uh,
remember latchkey kids. Yes.
right. So, so I literally came home from kindergarten to an empty home,
Wow.
key around my neck. And so I think very early on, I learned to pay attention. My
Mhm.
father was a tremendous alcoholic. And so I was really like keying in on behavior, because I never knew if I was going to get happy dad,
Mm.
mad dad, sad dad, drunk dad. And so I think very early in my life, I was learning to pick up those cues around where people were, where they were, and was their behavior predictable. And so I think that's something that obviously was a big part of my development, probably that early childhood trauma.
Mm.
I
Mhm.
think I've carried that with me. And the other thing, I think, just growing up kind of in that dysfunction of an early childhood experience, was that I was kind of a people pleaser, because I
Mm.
was trying to reduce the amount of tension in the
Sure.
household, which was at like 5 and 6 years old. Gee whiz. So, so that those experiences, I think, have been some of the greatest strengths that I've carried with me as I've gotten older. As long as I can keep that little boy in me kind of at bay and work through that fear that I was kind of talking about early in the show here.
Yeah, well, and here's what's impressive to me about you is that we all have choices on how our lives affect us, right? And how our circumstances affect us. I just had a guest on that said, life doesn't happen to you, life reacts to you. So you get to decide, yes, these bad things have happened. I've been dealt this hand that was not ideal. But am I going to be better or worse because of it? And you have decided to be better, and that exudes out of you in every way that it possibly can. And I guarantee you there are some people listening who have that in them as well. There are others that wish they could channel it. And I'm sure it's not always easy to channel, because there are probably days where you're like, you know what? No, I don't want to be this person today. I would like to be a different person, but you don't. And that's what's made you a successful human. So I have a question for you that I love to ask, because I get a different answer every time. So the show is called Productive Joy. What is your definition of productive joy?
I don't know that I've really thought about a particular definition, but I'll tell you what I think about when I think about the greatest joy that my professional life has brought to me is I was a middle school principal and a high school principal. So there was a group of students where I was their principal for 7 years. And building a relationship with kids and their parents and the extended family over that period of time, so many of those kids went off to college, come back, and they're now teaching in the district, or they're counselors in the district, or they're support staff in the district. And knowing that I was a part of, like, I had a great experience. So one of my former students, when I was a high school principal, she is a teacher in a neighboring district. She got teacher of the year.
Mm.
So I called up her superintendent. I said, "Hey, I'd love to see this former student of mine." And so show up at the school with the superintendent. I think she's teaching third grade. She's walking up the corridor with her class. And we get about 20 feet away from each other. And I see the moment she recognizes me. And she takes off sprinting towards me. And she's just in tears, these happy, ugly tears. And she says to her superintendent, "This is the man. This is the reason I went into education." And when you're around long enough to experience those are the moments we hope for, we like secretly hope for.
Yeah.
But when you can participate in real life in those moments, to me, that is productive joy. And here's the thing, in education, we never know what kind of an impact we're going to have on kids.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I would tell young teachers is like, I don't want you to think about this teacher student relationship as just being a year.
No.
Like, I'm going to have this kid for a year and then they're going to go do their thing and I'm going to do I said, I want you to think about this, that you're potentially entering into a relationship with your students that could last a lifetime.
Mhm.
You could be presiding over a former student's wedding. You could be invited to their college graduation. You could be invited to be a godparent of one of their children. And I think that's the humanity that we work with directly in education that has brought me a tremendous amount of joy. Now, I don't know if it's productive joy, but
Well, I would
these
call
are
it
the things
productive
that
if you
just
can
warm my
produce
heart.
a student who is now teacher of the year for a district. That's productive. I think it's also productive because it's easier to reach the goals that you've set, like we talked about, very clear goals, consistent goals. It's a whole lot easier to reach those if people trust you and know that you're in it for them. That goes back to the joy, right? The joy is I want to come to work because it's fun. I want to be a part of this because it's fun. Now, you and I are unique in our educational space because we do have a different impact on our people because we spend 1,000 hours with them a year, if it or more, and that's a very long time to pour in an imprint. But I think what I heard that translates regardless is time plus effort equals productive joy, right? So be in it for the long haul. Don't think it's a quick fix. It does take some time. But the efforts that you're putting in need to be towards the positive, towards the equipping people to be capable of doing their next steps, whatever those next steps are. And that will produce that level of joy that you can't manufacture. It just happens. Would you agree? Does that resonate?
Yeah, I think it totally resonates. And I think it's how you show up, how you decide to show up as a person, and what kind of impact are you going to make on somebody's life. And I would just to reinforce, I remember having a conversation with a young man in my office and he says, "I want to be a priest." And I said, "That's incredible. You should do that." And today he's a priest. And on the other end of the spectrum, or maybe not, I don't know, we got 5 guys playing in the NFL that played for our football team. We got kids, all over the place doing fantastic work in the world. And it just reminds me there's this kind of narrative around young people, teenagers especially. And when you get up close and you really inspect what's happening in our schools across the nation, I tell people I'm not worried at all. As a matter of fact, I think it's the next generation of students coming forward that are going to solve some of the world's biggest challenges
Yeah.
that, frankly, my generation hasn't done a great job at.
Yeah.
And I see that kind of talent. And here's the thing, talent is everywhere. There
Mhm.
are smart kids in every little nook and cranny of this earth. What they need is access and opportunity. And I
Yeah.
think when we're in positions to provide that, people will flourish.
I completely agree with you. And something that I had never really given much thought to until right this second is that we do, every kid doesn't get to reach their potential because every educator doesn't recognize the need to make that the case. Like you said, equity and access is hugely important. But I think that translates for life. Like I think about some of the bosses that I served, and my journey. I've been in education for 25 years, but it hasn't been your traditional track, right? So I left the classroom to work in the district office. Then I went back as an assistant principal, and then I left again to work for a nonprofit, right? Like and be education adjacent and help pour in. I had bosses who poured into me and made me better, and I had bosses who either saw my potential and was threatened by it or chose not to help me become the best version of myself. And I think that's a choice, right? As leaders, we have a choice. We can see our talent around us as a threat, or we can see the talent around us as an opportunity. And what you just said reminds me that if we're threatened by the fear of what if, right? Like what if they don't listen to me, or what if they don't become great, then we tend to stamp down all of the brilliance instead of letting them go, you know what, yes, do that, whatever that is. We do it with kids, but we stop somehow in that adult space. And maybe it's the teachers, right, in your district who knew that you were going to support them when they tried something a little more creative. But I'm thinking about my own team and how much I want my own team to recognize that I believe in you 100%. And I know you are capable of anything you put your mind to. So go do it. I'm never going to stop you. How, what advice, let's do it this way. What advice would you have for leaders to stop being afraid of somebody outshining you and helping polish their shine?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think I've always tried to think about that in these terms. Number one, if we're successful as a team, that's the name of the game. And I would often say to people, hey, look, your success is my success.
Right.
I was fortunate during my time as tenure that I had two of my cabinet members became superintendents in other districts. And that's a really neat feeling that when somebody, and I'll like, hey, my college GPA 2.8.
Woohoo.
2
Hey, you know what?
2.8 right here.
These get
Went
degrees.
to a state college. I knew from the get-go that I was probably not the smartest person in the room. But I think when you can build the psychological safety
Mhm.
and allow people to flourish and try things and kind of reframe what we think about failure. And then there's an interesting dynamic that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about. I had a physics teacher at one of my high schools. This guy literally went from selling women's shoes to being this incredible physics teacher, to the extent that we flew to Washington, D.C. He was recognized by the President of the United States and the National Science Foundation. And what was fascinating to kids loved him, parents loved him. Guess what his teaching colleagues thought of him?
Oh, they were threatened.
They were threatened.
How
They were
sad.
threatened. And very often time, I find that our best and our brightest are actually ostracized by their colleagues
Mhm.
because there's this fear like they might make me look bad because they're working harder, or they're having more of an impact with kids. And I think, wouldn't it be different if everybody was just truly happy for everybody else? And
Right.
we were all kind of like, right? It's like this concept of all ships rise
Yeah. Yeah.
rather than this idea of putting somebody down or trying to keep that, like it's like the organization is striving to maintain mediocrity,
All right.
which is not good when you're dealing with human beings.
No, well, it's not good, period, right? Like, why would anybody want to choose to be mediocre? And as the leader in that space, you do have to walk a fine line because if you say too much about the person who's doing amazing things, it can be demotivating. So it's more about recognizing that everybody's talents don't look exactly the same, but everybody has talents. And that's something I have learned a lot about recently, is just recognizing the beauty that comes from the uniqueness and making sure that people are able to be judged on the right talents, right? So I use this phrase a lot with my kids. I'll say, if we judge our ability to a goldfish's ability to climb a tree, and that's their measure of success, they're always going to feel stupid. Instead, we have to say, that fish can swim, and that, monkey can climb the tree, and the turtle can go super slow, but it carries its house with them. So recognizing people's talents in their space is just, it's important. And thank you for the reminder that even when you are the best at what you do, you might not be accepted for that. That might be actually looked down on. So as the leader, you have to create the psychological safety to make it okay for everybody to be successful.
Right. And I kind of felt like it was my responsibility to create space for people to find their support system and
Mm.
network them. Sometimes I was networking teachers outside of the district so that they could find that group of people
Yeah.
that were on fire and still keep things happening and moving forward in my district or in my former district. But people want to feel that connectedness, and they
Yeah.
want that shared value. And I don't know, it's something we've got to think deeply about in the education space. And maybe it happens in other professions too, but this idea of really ostracizing your best and brightest and
Right.
how to overcome that,
Yeah.
I think is there's some organizational culture that needs to be reworked around that.
Definitely. And I think that, step one is being secure enough in your own talents as a leader to recognize that you don't have to be the smartest person in the room. You said that, and I never am either. And I am completely okay with that, right? Like, I want my people to outshine me. But I do think that that's innately in me, and it's not innately in everyone, but it can be taught, it can be brought up, it can be nurtured to the point where anybody can have that talent. So, Mike, I could talk to you literally all day, but people also have a short attention span. So, I'm going to ask you some rapid fire questions. Are you ready? Are you
I'm
excited?
ready.
All right, I have
Yeah.
another definition for you. What is your definition of fun?
Spending time with the family and traveling. Love those two things.
Tell us a little bit about your family. I know you have twin girls.
Twin girls. My wife and I have been married for 34 years.
Well done.
Is it 34 or 37? I can't remember.
Oh,
It's
goodness. That's something you
yeah,
should know.
I should remember that.
Huh.
I think it's 37. And just having that family time, and I think I crave that so much because I was an only child. My wife, we're both first generation college graduates, got to throw that in there. But
Yeah.
the other thing is that she's got a really big family. And so I think I not only fell in love with her, I fell in love with the whole concept of big family.
Yeah.
And just love that. To me, that's a tremendous amount of fun.
Love it. Love it. Okay. How do you know that you're showing up as your authentic self?
When I feel a sense of vulnerability, that's when I believe I'm showing up as my authentic self. If it's a little bit scary, then I know I'm in the right place.
I like it. I like it. That's good. Okay. So, how do you channel your best self on your worst days?
Yeah, I really try and stay in gratitude. And when I think, and I actually have to credit my wife a lot for this, is she said, you know what, you're going to be fine. Things are going to be okay. There might be this one little moment in time where you're scared, but when you look at things, when you look, I guess I would say it like this: when you look at it in retrospective, a year behind you, it's a little blip on the radar screen. And
Yeah.
so I think that's how it's those, we talk about what does your brain, what record does your brain play? And you've got to constantly keep that little voice in. At least, I don't know if other people have those voices, but that's the voice that plays in my head, which is, you're not having a good day. Okay, how can I reframe that to reground myself and focus on gratitude and realize that I'm going to get through this and it's going to probably be okay.
Yeah. It probably is, right?
Right.
Chances are good. We have survived 100% of our bad days so far. So
Right. Yeah.
those are pretty good
Somebody
stats.
said to me one time, the worst thing that ever happened to me never happened to me. In other
Mm,
words, it's this idea that in our brains, that little voice in our head, it's it's wonderful at making things at least 10 times worse than reality.
yeah. Yeah. Power in those words. All right. Final question. What if people are only going to remember one major thing, one major point from our time together today? So if they can only remember one thing, what's the one thing you really want them to remember?
I think it's a combination of two things.
Okay,
It's
that's fair.
it's 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 one is really try not to be afraid. Be courageous. And in being courageous, that allows you to show up as your full self. And I think it's in your full self that you can have the greatest impact. Um, yeah, there you have it. So
I
that was, I
think
guess it was kind of three things, but
Well, no, it was really just don't be afraid to show up as you.
yeah,
I hear
right.
that as a theme.
Yeah.
And Mike, I am so honored that you took the time to do this. And I know that every listener today is going to gain some nuggets of wisdom because you have chosen to spend your entire life helping others. You don't want anybody to be that 5-year-old kid that's by themselves in the house with their key around their neck, right? You want people to recognize that they're surrounded by brilliance and that we all get to be brilliant together because of the things that you've chosen to do. So, congratulations on a very successful career and round two, because as we mentioned, you have failed retirement and you are still working. So, I just am appreciative that you took the time to be here today. So, thank you.
It
And
was great.
listeners,
Thanks.
thank you for being here for yet another productive joy experience. I am so honored that you guys are continuing to listen. Please share this podcast with everyone you know, because ultimately we all need a little more positivity, a little more productivity. And if you can put the two together, then that's a definite win. So thank you for being here today. And as always, figure out a way to turn fun into action.